Hello and welcome back. This is the week 12 lecture. So today we conclude our unit on literary criticism and theory. We're going to wrap it up with a bunch of different critical approaches today. They're all kind of related, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on any single one of them, but we're going to start with materialism, talk about the cultural materialists. They're kind of an important group. We just need to know some of their big ideas, and then we'll talk about new historicism, which is a very popular critical approach today. And then that will take us into postcolonialism, which is also an approach frequently used today. And then we can talk a little bit about cultural studies, which again is quite popular and frequently in use by a lot of scholars and critics today. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and I would like to keep this lecture a little bit shorter than what we've had each of the last 2 weeks. I know those have been long and jam-packed with information, but we do have a lot of ground to cover. But like I said, this is our final week covering critical approaches. So we'll get these last few in, and then we'll have a nice body of knowledge. We're going to have all of these critical approaches at our disposal when we tackle our next critical response. So that second critical response will require you to use one of the critical approaches we've been discussing over the last few weeks. So we started with formalism and reader response. We worked our way up to the structuralists, the post-structuralists, and then last week we talked about feminism and gender studies. Okay, so we've already covered a lot. Today, we wrap it up. So let's start today with materialism. I don't want to dig too deeply into this just because it's a complicated approach and we don't need to know a ton about it. But it is kind of important because it will set the stage for some of these other approaches that we are looking at today. So, materialism and cultural materialism in particular is pretty strongly influenced by Marxism. The studies conducted by Karl Marx, the theories, largely economic theories that he developed over the course of the 19th century. Again, in this country, we tend to reject Marxism, and that's fine. We don't have to adopt it as a political ideology here. And a lot of materialists and the critics and scholars using this approach, they don't necessarily subscribe to Marxism 100%, although some might identify that way politically, but we certainly don't have to. We just need to know a few of the big ideas that materialism kind of borrows from Marxism, because those ideas will continue to be important for some of these other approaches. So when we're talking about materialism as an approach, as a critical approach, let's just start with that word, materialism. Again, we don't need to get too deep into Marx and what we agree with or what we don't. We just need to think about what the materialists are looking at and doing with text. So for them, the whole idea of materialism is not necessarily a negative thing. We might think of it that way. It's kind of an insult if you call somebody materialistic. That means they just care about things. They just care about material items and not the things that are truly important. That's kind of the idea. That's often how the word gets used in our present day society. But as a philosophical concept, all materialism means is that matter is the fundamental substance in nature. So why that matters for us is that all mental states, everything that we think and feel, everything that goes on in our minds, in our brains, is the result of material things, the material world. You know, buildings, beds, food, other people, the interactions that we have with other people. All of those material things basically create our consciousness or create or strongly influence the way we think and feel. So the idea is, you know, for a materialist, the idea is that physical facts shape or sort of determine human consciousness. the physical facts of the material world. So, all right, well, that matters a lot for Marx in particular because he's very interested in economics. He's very interested in money and who has money. And it was his belief that economics is really the driving material force in all the world. That's the biggest driving material force in society. So Marx famously sort of divides society into the working class, which he calls the proletariat, and what he calls the bourgeoisie, or the ownership class, the owning, those who would have perhaps owned businesses or employed many people. These would have been the capitalist upper classes who typically owned businesses or, had more money, had more power and sort of comfort and more social status. So Marx drew a line between these groups, and he, of course, famously and wrongly predicted that eventually the proletariat would rise up in revolt because they were mistreated in some ways. And you got to keep in mind his time and place. Keep in mind his setting. 19th century, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, and he's in Europe. He's German, by birth, but he spends a lot of time in England as well, observing conditions in factories and a lot of other industrial workplaces of the time. And you have to remember, this is really before a lot of our modern labor laws took hold. So working conditions were often very dangerous, very unsanitary for a lot of these workers. Oftentimes they worked very long hours, low pay, difficult conditions. So there was this idea that it might not be sustainable to have this large working class that was kind of kept separate and treated as lesser than. So, we don't have to get too much into that, but what's more important for us is that culture and cultural productions like literature play a role in the class divisions that Marx is so interested in, because the ruling classes, the upper classes, the bourgeoisie, the ones who have money and own the companies, own the factories, according to Marx and a lot of cultural materialists, those kind of owning classes, those ruling classes would use culture. They would use cultural productions like literature, like music. Any sort of aspect of cultural expression could be commodified, sort of turned into a product that can be bought and sold, and it can then be used by the ruling classes to sort of control everybody else, or to at least entertain and distract the working classes, kind of keep their minds off of the oppression that they were suffering, so they can just be entertained. They can go to the movies, they can read their favorite action adventure stories or whatever, and they're kind of pacified. So that's the idea. We obviously don't have to necessarily all accept that, but a lot of cultural materialists take some of those ideas and kind of use them in their work. So again, Marxism is kind of important for this particular branch of literary criticism because it gives us this idea that literature and really any type of art can be treated like just a commodity. Something that can be bought and sold, something that's put on the market, and then the market sort of determines its value. So we don't have to get too far into any of that. This is not an economics class. This is not a history class. But that sort of way of looking at culture and looking at how the dominant culture, the dominant class, can use culture to kind of shape what we might call the dominant culture of a place, of a country, of a nation at a particular time and place. So you should wonder, ask yourself, is there sort of a dominant ruling culture right now in America? It doesn't mean that everybody necessarily subscribes to it or likes it, but just think about things that are popular, mainstream cultural products, the movies that are really popular, the book series that are very popular right now, that make a lot of money, that have a lot of readers or viewers or fans, the top streaming shows, like you could make the argument that a lot of those things comprise what is right now the dominant culture in the US. And if you're a cultural materialist, you might argue that a lot of those books and movies and shows are being used by the ruling classes to maintain their power in some way or another. But we can also kind of approach it in a different way. We can look at all of these different cultural products as, in some cases, representing other cultures, not the dominant culture, not the ruling class. Some of these cultural products might be expressions from marginalized groups, people who maybe historically haven't had a voice, people who haven't always been able to participate in the ruling class or the dominant culture. So that's another thing we can do with a lot of these approaches today. We can think about oppositional cultures. We can think about the cultures that might oppose or go against the dominant culture in some way. And we can also think about who's creating the dominant culture, who's sort of in charge, who's calling the shots. Is it the CEOs of these big, media conglomerates, these huge media companies, the heads of the movie studios, who's creating or I guess you could say, like, mainstreaming certain types of cultural expressions. Why do certain things become popular and not others, right? I mean, how are certain cultural products marketed? You can think about audience. We can think about advertising. There's a lot of interesting threads to pursue here. So the cultural materialists borrow a lot of these ideas from earlier Marxist critics. And again, you don't necessarily have to be a Marxist or believe in all of his economic ideas to sort of buy into certain aspects of cultural materialism. So if we're thinking about cultural materialism as a separate, sort of specific critical approach, it really develops in the years following World War II, so like the middle of the 20th century, and it largely comes out of England. A lot of the early cultural materialists were English dudes, but a lot of it filters over to the US very soon afterwards in a lot of important ways. So the materialists did borrow a lot from, like I said, those earlier Marxist thinkers. So the cultural materialists were typically a bit left-leaning. They were sort of champions of the working class or the non-dominant classes, the non-dominant cultures. And they were interested in sort of investigating how cultures get made, how certain cultures get sort of prioritized or privileged over others, and how some of these things can change over time. So one important thing to keep in mind is something that's really an important cultural event, a big thing that's happening in the 1950s in England, and it also really started to happen here as well. Is again, it's after World War II. A lot of young people, largely young men, are going back to school or pursuing college educations. And during this time, there's a real push, initially in England, in the 50s, to make what they would have called the classics sort of available and accessible to a larger group of people. So we're talking about Shakespeare, ancient Greek and Roman poetry or drama, the stuff that typically, historically, would have been the domain of the upper classes. And this is just something that is largely true from a historical perspective, both in Western Europe and here. For a long time, the study of literature, the study of a lot of cultural products like art, visual art, music, literature, a lot of that stuff was kind of thought of as being only for certain people, not necessarily for everyone. And the study of culture was often thought of as something that would be done by highly educated, really refined people who maybe came from moneyed backgrounds and were sort of, had experienced a lot of these cultural products for a long time. They went to the opera, they listened to classical music, they read classic works of literature. So there was this idea that it was largely for the upper classes, and a lot of what we might think of as middle class or working class people, they weren't always given access to a lot of those sort of classical works of art and literature. So there was this distinction that still gets made sometimes today, although I would say less commonly. But there used to be a distinction made between what was called high culture and low culture. So high culture would be like a bunch of the things I just mentioned, like the opera or ballet or going to watch plays, you know, in a theater or reading certain works of literature. That was high culture, and that was kind of reserved for the high classes. And then you had sort of even back then, you sort of had a popular culture that was more, it was just, you know, considered lesser than by most scholars and critics of the time. It would be stuff that was marketed more for middle class audiences. Again, maybe more action, adventure, simpler language, a little more contemporary, not often as old. So just separate, kind of two separate cultures. High culture for the rich folks, and then sort of low culture, kind of just cheap entertainment for working people who weren't as educated, probably didn't have a chance to go to college. Most middle class and working class people did not pursue higher education in, you know, previous historical eras. That's a relatively recent thing. So that's how it was for a long time. But after World War II, things are starting to change. Things are getting a little bit more democratic, a little bit more modern throughout the Western world. And this is part of it. This belief that we need to teach Shakespeare and, you know, Homer and all of this classic literature. We need to teach it to everybody, not just people at elite institutions, not just people from the upper classes. So increasingly, this type of literature is getting taught to really all students in colleges and universities, and in some cases even, you know, high school students, younger students starting to get exposed to a lot of this classic literature, whereas in previous generations they really wouldn't have been. So this is thought of by many as a good thing. This is largely thought of as a sort of expression of humanism. You know, it's a humanistic sort of development. That's kind of the label it's often given, this idea that let's make great art available to everyone, let's teach it in school. But another interesting thing happens that the cultural materialists talk about a lot is that this stuff becomes nationalized more than it ever had been before. So obviously, you know, Brits always knew that Shakespeare was, you know, from England, so they could always claim him as one of their own. But it's during this period when the stuff is getting taught more and it's becoming standard curriculum at a lot of schools that increasingly, you know, Shakespeare now becomes an English writer, right? He becomes a representative of the country. He's a national treasure. And we do this in America too, because we have a very similar thing happening here very soon afterward, throughout the 50s and 60s, as English departments sort of assume their current modern form and the study of literature starts to become standardized in American colleges and universities. This same thing happens. We say, hey, let's share the best American literature ever produced. And again, we can certainly disagree with some of the choices that were made, but the idea was, let's teach Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, you know, the author of Moby Dick. Let's teach these great writers to basically all college students. High school students will get a little bit of it as well. And these are great American writers. They are national symbols. So over time, we start to teach students, and we still do, I do, because I teach a lot of these guys. We start to teach students that these American writers, they represent certain American ideals or values, or, you know, the themes in their literature are, you know, really connected to the history and culture that we have here. Like, you know, you hear that with F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby, right? Which is a great American novel that's said to represent a lot of things about America. So that's how we've taught a lot of these authors, making them accessible, making them available, celebrating them, and making them represent our nation. So that happens in England, and we have the development of British literature as it gets taught today, and then it also happens here in the States, and we get the development of American literature as it still gets taught today. So this is happening in the middle of the 20th century, and the cultural materialists in some ways are kind of pushing back against it a little bit. On one hand, yes, they are recognizing that this is a sort of democratic process in sort of the traditional sense of just giving more people power, and that's good, giving more people knowledge and information. But they're also noticing that the ruling classes, once again, are using culture. They're using these great books, these great novels, these great writers to sort of create a value system and a power structure where they get to remain on top. And that's something that cultural materialists explore a lot, how the ruling classes use these great classic works of literature and other forms of art to sort of maintain power, to keep the class divisions in place, to keep the power structure as it is. But not everybody agrees with that. Like, you know, so you can use some of these approaches and look for different things. So there's a cultural materialist in England named Stuart Hall who was writing in the 70s and 80s and I think even through the 90s. And he was a black British guy. You know, his family had immigrated from the Caribbean, I want to say Jamaica. So he had a little bit of a different perspective, and he wrote about how, yes, on one hand, the ruling classes do use culture to kind of reinforce, you know, cultural values or other things that kind of perhaps maintain the status quo. But he says at the same time, you can't really control culture, and there's never just one at a time. So even though there is that dominant culture that's, you know, maybe sort of keeping things in line, there's always other cultures, oppositional cultures, different kinds of cultures. And he's kind of speaking a little bit from his own experiences growing up in sort of immigrant communities in England, where a lot of people from the Caribbean had migrated, and they sort of were able to maintain certain aspects of their culture while also getting absorbed into the dominant, predominantly white culture of England. So he's kind of observing that process, and he points out that, yeah, we can, you know, culture can be democratized, it can be socialized, and different classes, different groups create their own cultures, and they create their own cultural expressions, which will often be different from the expressions of the dominant culture, or the expressions, that the cultural products that the dominant culture is sort of taking for their own, and saying, oh yeah, this is a great book because it says all these good things about us and our country. But Hall's saying, yeah, there can always be other cultures. There can always be different cultures. So there is maybe a dominant culture that has most of the power or has most of the financial backing, but there's always other voices and other expressions. So that's a pretty important idea. And a lot of them also just kind of look at the way that culture gets produced. They view culture as a productive process. So there's another famous materialist named Raymond Williams. We don't have to know a lot about him or Hall, but Williams introduces an interesting idea, again, about culture. And I might get some of this wrong. I don't remember all the details, and I didn't write it all down. But Williams talks about kind of three different types of cultures that can be separate or different from the dominant culture. So he mentions residual cultures, emergent cultures, and oppositional cultures. I think those are the three, and I'm pretty sure I remember what each one is. Residual just means it's like the holdover, or it's the last remains of an old culture that used to exist but has been largely displaced. Because, of course, like everything, like, you know, everything involving humans, we're always changing. We're advancing in some ways. Things don't really always stay the same. So there can be old cultures that are in place for a long time, but then they get displaced because of technological change or, migration patterns, people moving, just other aspects of modernization. So Williams is speaking a little bit from experience. He's Welsh. So some of you might be familiar with Wales. It is part of Great Britain. I mean, it's on the island, with the rest of England, but they're kind of separate culturally. They kind of have a little bit of a distinct culture and history from the rest of Great Britain, the rest of the British Isles. So they've been largely absorbed by British culture, but they have at least they used to have their own language and sort of their own folk tales and sort of their own culture. But Williams talks a lot about, he grew up in this very isolated rural Welsh village, but then he goes away for school, and when he comes back home to visit, every time he comes back, he notices more things are changing. More aspects of modernity are creeping in. They get running water, they get electricity, people aren't speaking the native, dialect anymore or whatever. But even though things are changing and they're modernizing and they're increasingly getting integrated into sort of mainstream, the dominant culture of England, they still have this residual culture. They still have certain stories, certain songs, certain aspects of cultural expression that are different from what you would find in the rest of Great Britain. So that's kind of what he means. And I think we can relate to that. If any of you have lived in a place for a really long time, like if you're a local in a particular place where maybe there's lots of transplants, lots of people move there from other places, you kind of know what Williams is talking about. There's always certain inside jokes or lingo or just certain historical knowledge. You know about what happened here 20 years ago, and somebody who just moved into town doesn't. So a lot of times these small kind of unique places that they have their own culture, some parts of that culture go away over time, but people are able to hang on to some other parts. So that's kind of what he means with residual culture. Then he talks about emergent cultures, and we kind of get what that means. It just means cultures that are emerging. These are kind of new cultures because, again, things are changing. New cultures get created as people move and, different interactions take place and things advance or progress in different ways. So you can have new cultures emerging, sort of breaking onto the scene, and they might challenge the dominant culture, or in time, as we might see later, an emergent culture can eventually become the dominant culture. It can become the culture of the ruling classes, maybe eventually. We might see an example of that. And then there's also oppositional cultures, which again just means, cultures that are sort of going against, or they are in some ways different than the dominant culture. So there can be all of these different kinds of cultural elements that are existing at the same time, and in some cases in the same place. So they can explore all of that, and they can explore that at work in specific texts. So you can use this to approach a particular novel, a particular short story, if that text is perhaps expressing an alternative culture, viewpoints, or if it's some kind of oppositional or emergent culture being expressed through a text. Or we can go into a text created by the dominant culture, endorsed by the ruling classes, and we can see how other cultures or other classes function within that text. How do the working class characters function? How are they described? What kind of worldview is being sort of conveyed? What is the theme here that's being sort of reinforced by the dominant classes? We can also perform that kind of analysis as well. So yeah, we'll just wrap it up with the cultural materialist, because a lot of us probably won't use this approach, but it can be interesting. They're often interested in marginalized groups, again, sort of non-dominant cultures, the non-ruling classes. So looking at working class and middle class culture. looking at immigrant cultures, or some of those residual cultures that are still hanging on in the face of great change. And they're also really interested, like I was saying earlier, in how these big classic texts from a particular country can be used by the ruling class to validate or inscribe certain values or beliefs. And this is important for us as well, because like I said, this is happening in the US. So as English departments are modernizing in the middle of the 20th century, we're doing this. And there's a great quote, we don't have to worry about who says it, but this other cultural materialist says, I think he's writing in the 70s or 80s as well, he says, you know, we have an increasingly secularized world. That just means fewer people are religious now than used to be. Obviously, religion is still around. A lot of people are still religious, but fewer people than what we would have seen in previous eras. So a lot of these guys were saying there's so much secularization now. We need another way to sort of provide moral instruction or to create a moral ideology. An ideology is just like a system of beliefs. So because religion doesn't quite have the same sway that it used to, they were saying at the end of the 20th century, it's really art. And that includes literature. It's largely art that can provide moral ideology to people. It's not that it necessarily replaces religion, because it's not the exact same as religion, but it can do something that religion traditionally did for more people, which is sort of provide a moral ideology, certain values and beliefs that we can share and uphold as a people. And it's kind of this unifying, it has this unifying effect. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Not everybody looks at it as a bad thing, but the cultural materialists are just interested in how that's happening. They're kind of observing it in its early stages throughout the second half of the 20th century as English departments start to look like they do now, and the study of literature starts to look like it looks now. I mean, that is largely what we're doing. And again, just if any of you pursue English, pursue literature, you'll see that we still do it in the ways being described here. We have British lit, we have American lit. That's typically what gets taught, at least in this country. So we've nationalized the great books, the classics, but we do try to teach them to everyone. And a lot of people think that's good, but we can still perhaps analyze ways that the ruling classes uses those texts. And what are they using them for? What are they teaching us? What is the moral ideology that they're using this art to provide us with? You guys can think more about that. All right, so the cultural materialism is still around. People still practice it, but those guys are very interested in history. They're influenced a little bit by Marxism, and they help to set the stage for a critical approach that a lot of us probably will want to use, and an approach that's still very popular, that's very much in use today, and that is the new historicism. So if you guys remember, at the very beginning of our unit on critical approaches, I mentioned that there were some old traditional approaches to literature that kind of predate the standardized discipline of literary studies that we know today. So I ran through a few of those old traditional approaches to lit that have really been around for centuries. So I mentioned the biographical approach, where you sort of study the work of literature through the author's life, using the biography of the author. We talked about the moral approach, sort of, just seeking out the moral of the story or the larger theme, the sort of message, and just focusing on that. And then another traditional approach was the historical approach, viewing literature through the lens of historical context, basically. So that's been around for a long time. And basically people would use the work of literature to learn more about the historical time period that was being depicted in the text, or the historical time period in which the text was written. So people have done that for a long time. People continue to do that. But now we have the new historicism, which is a return to historical context. We are once again interested in historical context, but we're not doing it in quite the same old traditional way. So the sort of tagline or catchphrase for new historicism, there's two parts to it. First, the text is historical. So that means we cannot transcend historical context. We can't get away from the importance of historical context. So this is a direct response, really, to formalism. Remember, the formalists, our first critical school or approach, they said, no, we don't care about context, we don't care about the biography, we don't care about the history. But new historicists say the meaning of a text cannot transcend the context of the text. And if you think about it, I think a lot of us might agree with that. The meaning is at least in part shaped by the context. It is at least influenced in some way by the context. So we can't ignore historical context. We can't just get rid of it or move completely beyond it if we want to understand the meaning of the literary text. Okay, so that's what they mean when they say the text is historical. But also, and this is kind of the weird part, history is textual. So that means human actions and institutions and all of the narratives that we tell about our history, all of the facts and things that we know about our history, largely consist of literary elements. They read a lot like literature. And this is true. The way we present history, the way we understand history is largely in narrative form. History is often told in the form of a story where we have a plot and we have characters and we have different settings, and there's often some kind of a theme or some kind of larger meaning that we're supposed to walk away understanding. So the idea is, because the telling of history has so much in common with literature, we can study it in the same way that we study literature. We can look for a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same devices. We're going to find irony in history. We're going to find contradiction. Like we said, we're going to find characters. We're going to find settings and plots and all of these elements and aspects of literature that we've been studying all semester. So we can look for those things in history, and we can also view history as just additional texts. They're just other narratives that we can study alongside literary texts. But we can also use a lot of these tools of literary analysis to also study and analyze history. So this is kind of a return to that old focus on historical context. But now we understand that history isn't necessarily always like more stable or more reliable than literature. It's just another thing that's shaping the literature. It's just a big part of the literature. But then there might be cases where literature helps to shape history. Sometimes we can read literature into history just like we read history into literature. So they're very interested in sort of treating these two types of texts in a lot of similar ways. And we're not just looking at history anymore as background. We're not just looking at it as context. We see the history as playing a bigger role, frankly. And the history and the literature are kind of inseparable in a lot of ways, if we want to use this approach. So again, a lot of history is going to be complex and nuanced and unstable, just like literature often is. So there can be multiple meanings, contradictions. We can do a lot of the same stuff we do with lit when we look at history. So again, we can kind of put history, sort of well-known historical narratives side by side with works of literature. We can see how history works in literature, but we can also see how literature might influence history, and we can explore a lot of their commonalities and similarities. But a lot of new historicists are influenced by some of these ideas passed down from Marxism and cultural materialism. So they'll often kind of look at what they might call as like master narratives, or sort of like dominant cultural or national narratives, like stories that countries like to tell about themselves, the sort of narratives, the historical narratives that get taught in school, that get taught to children at an early age. So these are, again, kind of part of the ruling classes, according to a certain perspective. These are part of the sort of dominant culture that gets passed out to everybody, in large part to unify us, to give us kind of this shared body of knowledge and texts and stories and values. That moral ideology that art can provide, history can sort of help to do that too. These are the stories we tell ourselves. Some of these stories are fictional. Some of these stories might be supposedly nonfiction, but they often function in similar ways. So oftentimes new historicists will sort of study, again, how these kind of master narratives can be used in some cases for the dominant culture or the dominant classes to maintain power, but then we can also revise these narratives, and then new narratives can get told. A lot of new historicists are interested in uncovering new histories, new perspectives, new angles from maybe less represented groups that had not previously been noticed or given much attention to. Now we can add those narratives to the larger national narratives, and there might be some conflict, there might be some give and take, but that's a process that is kind of playing out today. So that's pretty much it for new historicism. But like I said, influenced by cultural materialists, a little bit influenced by Marxism, and the same is true largely for post-colonial studies. So this is the final critical approach that we'll cover today. And this is sort of broadly speaking, to give a very general definition, post-colonial, the post-colonial approach is mostly just interested in cultural expressions, art, literature, from former colonial spaces. So places that used to be British or Spanish or French colonies, whether they were in the Caribbean. We, of course, could fall into this large category. The U.S. used to be British colonies, of course. But as we know, European colonial powers had colonies throughout the globe, in Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, parts of the Pacific. So basically, the post-colonial approach is interested not only in the cultural expressions coming from these places now that they have become independent and they sort of have these complicated histories, they have these combinations of cultures oftentimes. So those cultural expressions, those works of literature coming from those places can often be subjects of study, but also we can look at classic works from the British and American literary tradition that often sort of endorse a white, sort of more mainstream perspective. We can look at how these colonial spaces or post-colonial spaces get depicted in those kinds of narratives. So a famous example that's often used to kind of exemplify post-colonial approach is Heart of Darkness, written by Joseph Conrad, a famous novella written at the end of the 19th century. Conrad was Polish by birth, but he wrote in English. He lived in France and England as an adult for the most part, but he mostly wrote in English, and this book is widely taught and read in both England and the U.S., but it's set in Africa, but it's told through the perspective of a European, and it very much is a European perspective on Africa and colonialism, written really during a sort of peak period of colonialism in the very late 1800s. So a lot of post-colonial critics will revisit that text now and sort of find some of the ways in which certain sort of destructive stereotypes about Africans were sort of popularized or disseminated by that particular text. And there's a lot of other examples of popular American and British literature that sort of has unfavorable depictions of African characters or Asian characters, people in the Caribbean, people in Latin America, people in the Pacific, or whatever. And we can examine those perspectives, those stereotypes, and the impacts they've had on audiences and how they've maybe had larger influences in our culture and society. So that's a big part of what post-colonial critics can do. But like I said, this is also largely about kind of like what we were talking about with feminism last week, sort of trying to discover more texts written by sort of traditionally oppressed, marginalized groups, immigrant groups, because again, one thing that we see throughout history, we were talking about this a little bit with Stuart Hall, a lot of people from these post-colonial spaces will end up immigrating to the place that originally colonized them. So like people from Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago immigrating to England, which happened a lot over the course of the mid to late 20th century, like Stuart Hall's family. So there's this weird cultural collision that happens when you see migration patterns like that. So, these people come to England with their sort of their native culture, which even in and of itself is kind of a hybrid culture, because if you're from Jamaica, that was a British colony mostly populated by descendants of African slaves, but there were a lot of different cultural aspects getting thrown into that stew. You had Brits, you had other Europeans, you had Native Americans, you had Spaniards, French, you had different groups of Africans brought over during slavery. So that culture that develops in a place like Jamaica is kind of a hybrid culture. It's another term that would get used, that might be used by a lot of these types of critics. But then they go to England, like Stuart Hall's family, and they have to get absorbed back into the colonizers' dominant culture years after that initial colonization. So there's just a lot of weird stuff going on there. It's very rich for exploration and analysis. And it's not just England that's seen that kind of immigration. France has seen something very similar in its former North African and Caribbean colonies. A lot of people from those places immigrate to France, and the U.S. also sees immigration from a lot of post-colonial spaces in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in other parts of the world as well. But again, we have an interesting role in this history because we used to be colonial subjects of the Brits. So some people would say that American literature is post-colonial in some ways, but we also, in some indirect ways, we didn't have a colonial empire like these European countries, but we did make some colonial moves, some colonizing moves, perhaps, in places like the Philippines, in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico. So that's part of our history as well. So we kind of occupy a weird sort of middle position where we've been sort of on both sides of this equation. So we can always go and discover texts from these places and see how these are different cultural expressions. These are different cultures, different ideas, different literary techniques, different styles. So we can study all of that. But again, we can also go back to the texts that are already in the dominant culture, often written by the dead white guys, and see how these other cultures, these colonial spaces, were depicted, described, and represented. And we can find interesting things there as well. All right. And yeah, just one final concept that is kind of important for post-colonial studies, and I was kind of getting at it a little bit a moment ago, is transculturation. Transculturation is sort of like this process of hybridization. In an era where we have more and more globalization, more and more movement and communication in many ways, we do have certain cultural blendings, if we will, meldings, different cultures kind of coming together. It's not always harmonious, certainly not at first, but often new cultures can emerge. We might see emergent cultures. Again, we can often see this with immigrant cultures. Emergent cultures, they're not the dominant culture, perhaps, but they exist. They have their own they have their own musical traditions. They might have their own literary styles. They might have certain expressions, certain fashion choices that are unique to that particular culture, but they exist within a larger dominant culture that's different. And they might borrow certain aspects from that dominant culture while also maintaining some older aspects from some other culture, their original culture or whatever. And then sometimes, like I said, when two cultures collide, a new culture might be created. So those are the kinds of things we can explore with the post-colonial approach. All right, so the final thing I want to cover today is cultural studies. All right, this is very connected to what we were talking about, these other approaches, but this is another thing that's really popular today. A lot of critics and scholars use cultural studies, and I think a lot of you might like it because it's really wide open. The whole idea is we can use a lot of these techniques that have traditionally been used for high art, like literature and some of those other examples of high art that I mentioned before, and we can use those techniques to study any type of cultural expression. So, TV, movies, graphic novels, music, we can, it's all fair game with cultural studies. We're basically borrowing a lot of elements from previous critical approaches, and we're using a lot of traditional tools of literary analysis to just tackle a lot of different kinds of cultural productions. But a lot of cultural critics are, again, influenced by a little bit by Marxism, a little bit by the cultural materialists, and there's a little bit of new historicism at work as well. So we're often interested in sort of uncovering the cultural expressions of groups that might have been oppressed or marginalized or just didn't have the power, the non-dominant groups, the non-ruling classes. But also cultural studies is interested in how culture changes and evolves. And we can often see emergent cultures sort of gaining ground and perhaps in time merging with or even becoming the dominant culture. So just a common example, a sort of easy example to use of sort of how this sort of change can happen is hip hop or rap music, which is probably the most popular type of music in America now. But in the 80s, and going back even to its formation in the 70s, it was certainly an aspect of a certain culture, but not the dominant culture. It was out there, it was available if you kind of knew where to look, but it wasn't quite mainstream until the end of the 80s, the early 90s, I would say. And I'm no expert, but it sort of went from being a niche thing that was largely an aspect of African American culture in the U.S., largely in urban areas, like New York City. And then it went from that to becoming increasingly popular, increasingly mainstream, and now it's arguably in a position of more power. So that's just one aspect of culture. It's not really a culture all by itself, but that's an example of how something can start out as maybe a part of an emergent culture, it's sort of an oppositional culture. It's not mainstream. It wasn't initially a part of the dominant U.S. culture, but now it is. Over the last 30 to 35 years, it has become a part, I would say, of our mainstream dominant culture. So we could explore that, but some would say, yeah, and now it's being used by the ruling classes to help control everybody else. It used to be this sort of expression of rebellion, a sort of oppositional viewpoint, and now it might be a tool of the ruling class. But people made the same argument about rock and roll music. The music of my parents' generation, starts out as being part of a counterculture. It starts out being oppositional, alternative, and then it gets sort of adopted. It gets mainstreamed. It gets adopted by the dominant class, and it becomes common, popular, and maybe it loses the edge that it initially had. So you can do that kind of exploration with cultural studies, but again, they're interested in sort of tearing down that old barrier between high art or high culture and low culture. So for cultural studies people, that distinction doesn't matter. We can study any form of culture. So and you see a lot of this today. If any of you read sort of like pop culture websites or like entertainment websites, you'll see a lot of cultural criticism getting conducted in those places. You'll see, writers analyzing like reality TV shows, like shows like The Bachelor, or a few years ago when it was still big, The Kardashians. Stuff that would have traditionally perhaps been considered kind of trashy, kind of lowbrow, certainly low culture, like low art, not high culture, but cultural critics nowadays would say, but it's still very interesting and it tells us a lot about our culture. It tells us a lot about who has power, who's controlling the expression. It tells us a lot about the audience and what people want and what people are watching for. So this is very much popular and going on right now. But they're also interested just in how culture gets produced. Again, like the cultural materialists and like Marxists, who were very interested in the means of production. They were very interested in economics and how stuff got made, because a lot of Marxist critics would argue that one thing that the bourgeoisie, the ownership class, what they do to the workers is they kind of separate the workers from the products that the workers create. So the workers don't always feel a real sense of ownership. They're sort of separate from the market value of the thing that they make. So anyway, we don't have to care too much about that, but that's sort of the basis of this idea. It's like we don't only have to study the work of literature, we can also think about how it gets made. The publishing company that puts it out, they're making money off of it, right? How is the work of literature marketed? How is it advertised? We can think about the audience, who is it being sold to? Who's creating it? Who's profiting off of it? And who's buying it? Because, again, this is a commodity. It exists in the marketplace. It can be bought and sold. So that's another thing that we could potentially analyze. But we've kind of been doing cultural studies really throughout the semester with our alternative medias, because we've been looking at all kinds of different cultural expressions, high, low, everywhere in between, and we're simply figuring out what they mean. But again, we can always figure out what they say or reveal about the dominant culture, oppositional cultures, emergent cultures. They always have a lot to say about what's going on in our time and place, or in whatever time and place they're representing. So this is another kind of politically engaged approach. And a lot of cultural critics will think of themselves as being somewhat oppositional or somewhat opposed to the dominant power structures, but not always. And like a lot of what we were saying last week with feminism and gender studies, a big thing that you should notice with post-colonialism, even new historicism, going back to cultural materialism, and here with cultural studies, is a lot of what we're doing is about, once again, creating more seats at the table, getting more perspectives, studying more, different types of texts, different types of perspectives and experiences, getting more people at the table to sort of participate in the production of culture. And that's a big goal of all of these critical approaches. They're doing other things too, but that's a big sort of through line that we can track through a lot of these different approaches. Just looking at new perspectives, new angles, and maybe challenging some of our master narratives, some aspects of our dominant culture or our ruling class, if we think that we do in fact have one. Okay, so that's enough for this week. I'm going to have the final version of all the notes posted in the Week 12 module. So all the notes on all the critical approaches that we've covered will be there. So please keep that document handy. I'm also going to be providing some new works of literature, some new examples of short fiction, drama, and poetry, maybe a short novel. I'm not quite sure yet, but I'm going to give you guys some new literary texts to work with so you can analyze them for critical response 2. So for critical response 2, you're going to take one of these critical approaches and you're going to use it to help you analyze one of our new works of literature. So if you have any questions, let me know. Please get in touch, and I'll see you next week.